160 years ago, the United States was a country so divided that fathers fought sons, and brothers fought brothers on the very same battlefield. Between 1861 and 1865, the United States tore itself apart in a war that would kill more Americans than World War I and World War II combined. Whole towns were burned to ash. Families were split down the middle, some loyal to the Union, others to the Confederacy, and many never spoke to each other again. This is the story of the American Civil War, a war over slavery, power, money, and the very soul of a nation. Before we get into it, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and follow this channel so you never miss a story like this again. And here's a question for you. Comment below and let me know, which country are you watching this from right now? I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Now let's rewind the clock back to the early 1800s, when the cracks in America first began to show. By the mid-1800s, America was really two different countries stitched into one flag. The North was rapidly industrializing, filled with factories, railroads, banks, and immigrants pouring in from Europe looking for work and opportunity. The South, on the other hand, remained agricultural, built almost entirely on massive plantations growing cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. But the true engine behind Southern wealth was not machinery or innovation, it was slavery. Nearly 4 million enslaved black men, women, and children were forced to work without pay, without rights, and without freedom, generating enormous profits for plantation owners while enduring unimaginable cruelty. As the North began pushing to limit or abolish slavery in new territories, the South saw this as a direct attack on their economy, their culture, and their entire way of life. For decades, Congress tried to hold the country together through political compromises. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But every single one of these only delayed the inevitable explosion. Then, in November 1860, a tall, self-taught lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election. Lincoln hadn't even appeared on the ballot in most Southern states, yet his anti-slavery expansion stance was enough to terrify the South. Within just weeks, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union, and other Southern states quickly followed, eventually forming the Confederate States of America under President Jefferson Davis. The nation, once united under one flag, was now splitting violently in two. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union-held fort sitting in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Remarkably, no one died in that initial bombardment, but the message was crystal clear. War had officially begun. President Lincoln quickly called for 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union, and almost overnight, young men across America traded their plows, desks, and shop counters for rifles and uniforms. The Confederacy, confident and proud, believed the North would back down quickly, unwilling to fight a long, costly war. They were completely wrong. What followed was not a short skirmish, but a brutal, drawn-out conflict that would stretch across 4 devastating years and reshape the entire country. Major battles soon erupted across Virginia, Tennessee, and Maryland. At the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, curious spectators from nearby Washington, D.C. actually rode out with picnic baskets, expecting to watch an easy, entertaining Union victory from a safe distance. Instead, they witnessed pure chaos, terrifying bloodshed, and a stunning Confederate victory that sent panicked civilians and soldiers alike fleeing back toward the capital. That single day shattered any illusion that this war would be quick, clean, or easy. Both sides began digging in for what would become a long and horrifying struggle. As 1862 rolled in, both armies scrambled to build, train, and equip forces on a scale America had never seen before. New rifled muskets and the deadly Minié ball made infantry combat far more lethal than outdated tactics accounted for, since generals were still using formations designed for older, less accurate weapons. This deadly mismatch between old strategy and new technology led to horrifying casualty numbers on both sides. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 shocked the entire country, with roughly 23,000 combined casualties over just 2 days, more American losses than every previous American war combined up to that point. Meanwhile, at sea, the war introduced a groundbreaking new form of combat when the ironclad ships USS Monitor and CSS Virginia battled to a standstill for ever-changing naval warfare. On land, General George McClellan led a massive Union campaign toward Richmond, the Confederate capital, but hesitated repeatedly, allowing Confederate General Robert E. Lee to outmaneuver him again and again. Lee's aggressive tactics and brilliant battlefield instincts made him a legendary and feared commander, even as the war's true cost in blood kept climbing higher with every passing month. Then came September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam, still the single bloodiest day in American history, with over 22,000 casualties in roughly 12 brutal hours near a quiet creek in Maryland. Though militarily more of a draw than a clear victory, Antietam gave President Lincoln the political opening he desperately needed. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people living in Confederate-held territory. This single document transformed the entire purpose of the war. It was no longer just a fight to preserve the Union. It had become a moral crusade to end slavery itself, and it opened the door for roughly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors to eventually join Union forces. Later that same year, the Battle of Gettysburg became the true turning point of the entire war. Over 3 brutal days in July 1863 in Pennsylvania, Union forces under General George Meade held their ground against repeated, desperate Confederate assaults, including the disastrous Pickett's charge. The Union victory, combined with the fall of Vicksburg on the exact same week, giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River, shattered Confederate momentum for good. From this point forward, the tide of war began shifting decisively and permanently toward the North. By 1864, President Lincoln appointed General Ulysses S. Grant to lead all Union forces, and Grant brought with him a ruthless, relentless new strategy: total war. Rather than chasing isolated victories, Grant understood that grinding down the Confederacy's manpower, supply lines, and morale would ultimately win the war, even at a horrifying human cost. Grant pursued Lee's army through Virginia in a series of brutal battles: the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, trading enormous casualties for steady, unrelenting pressure. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman marched his army through Georgia and the Carolinas, burning plantations, railroads, warehouses, and supply lines in his infamous March to the Sea. Sherman's goal was brutal but devastatingly effective: destroy the South's ability to fight, not just its armies. City after city fell: Atlanta, Savannah, Columbia, leaving smoking ruins in their wake. The Confederacy's economy, transportation network, and public morale collapsed almost simultaneously under this relentless pressure. On April 9, 1865, exhausted, outnumbered, and out of supplies, General Robert E. Lee formally surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively bringing the Civil War to its end after 4 grueling years of bloodshed. But peace came wrapped in heartbreak. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the night of April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The man who had guided the fractured nation through its darkest, bloodiest chapter would never live to see the full rebuilding and reunification of the country he had fought so hard to save. His death sent shockwaves through a nation already exhausted by 4 years of relentless war, and it left the difficult task of reconstruction to leaders far less prepared to handle the deep wounds still splitting the country apart. Grief, uncertainty, and lingering hostility hung heavy over both the North and the South in the days and weeks that followed, even as the guns finally fell silent across the battlefields. While soldiers bled on distant battlefields, the war reshaped daily life for millions of ordinary Americans who never fired a shot. In the North, factories ran around the clock producing rifles, uniforms, ammunition, and railroad supplies, and the war effectively kick-started an industrial boom that would define America for the rest of the century. Women stepped into roles they had never held before, running farms, managing businesses, and working in factories while husbands, sons, and brothers marched off to war. In the South, the picture was far grimmer. The Union naval blockade strangled Confederate trade, causing severe shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods. Prices skyrocketed so badly that in cities like Richmond, hungry crowds broke into shops during what became known as the Bread Riots of 1863. Meanwhile, thousands of enslaved people took matters into their own hands, escaping to Union lines whenever Northern armies came close, seeking freedom in the chaos of war. Hospitals on both sides overflowed with wounded soldiers, and disease, not bullets, actually killed more men than combat itself, as camps became breeding grounds for dysentery, typhoid, and infection, long before modern medicine understood germ theory. Letters between soldiers and their families back home became treasured lifelines, often the only connection between the front lines and loved ones, who had no idea if their husbands, sons, or fathers were still alive from one week to the next. One of the most powerful and often overlooked chapters of the Civil War is the story of black soldiers who fought for their own freedom. After the Emancipation Proclamation opened the door, roughly 200,000 black men enlisted in the Union Army and Navy, despite facing lower pay, discrimination, and the horrifying threat of enslavement or execution if captured by Confederate forces. Regiments like the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry proved their extraordinary courage during the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863, suffering devastating losses while demonstrating undeniable bravery under brutal fire. Their sacrifice helped shift public opinion in the North and proved that black soldiers were just as capable and committed as their white counterparts, even in the face of an unjust system that still refused them equal treatment. These soldiers weren't just fighting to preserve the Union, they were fighting directly for their own liberty, the freedom of their families, and the future of millions of enslaved people across the country. Their contribution to the eventual Union victory remains one of the most powerful and inspiring stories to come out of the entire war. In November 1863, just a few months after the devastating battle, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to help dedicate a new national cemetery for the thousands of soldiers who had died there. His speech that day lasted barely 2 minutes, yet it became one of the most powerful pieces of political rhetoric in American history. In it, Lincoln reframed the entire meaning of the war, describing it as a test of whether a nation founded on the idea that all people are created equal could actually survive. He honored the fallen soldiers not just as casualties of battle, but as men who had given what he called the last full measure of devotion to ensure that democracy itself would endure. The speech reminded a war-weary nation exactly what was at stake, and it tied the bloodshed at Gettysburg directly to the founding principles laid out nearly a century earlier in the Declaration of Independence. Even today, students across the world memorize and study this brief address, a testament to how a handful of carefully chosen words can capture the soul of an entire conflict and shape how future generations remember it. The Civil War ultimately claimed the lives of over 620,000 soldiers, making it by far the deadliest war in American history, with total casualties surpassing every other American conflict combined up until that point. Entire generations of young men were wiped out, towns were reduced to rubble, and the Southern economy lay completely in ruins for decades afterward. Yet out of this devastation came monumental, lasting change. The 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery across the entire United States in December 1865. The 14th and 15th Amendments soon followed, granting citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people, though true equality and justice would still take another full century of struggle, protest, and sacrifice to even begin to achieve. The Civil War didn't just reshape America's laws, it fundamentally reshaped its national identity. It forced the country to finally confront the brutal contradiction between its founding ideals of liberty and equality and the horrifying reality of slavery that had existed since its earliest days. Even today, more than 150 years later, the war's legacy continues to echo loudly through American politics, culture, monuments, and ongoing conversations about race, memory, and equality. It remains, without question, one of the most defining and consequential chapters in the entire story of the United States. Battlefields like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh are now preserved as national parks, drawing millions of visitors every year who walk the same ground where history was violently rewritten. Historians, filmmakers, and authors continue to study and retell this era because its themes, division, sacrifice, freedom, and the cost of national identity, still resonate powerfully with audiences around the world today. And that's the incredible, tragic story of the American Civil War, a war that tore a nation apart, ended slavery, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and completely reshaped the future of the United States forever. If you learned something new today, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and follow this channel for more deep dives into history's most defining and dramatic moments. And don't forget, drop a comment below and tell me which country you're watching this from. I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to see just how global and diverse this amazing community really is. This story still shapes how Americans understand freedom, unity, and sacrifice today, and it's a reminder of just how fragile a nation can be when it refuses to confront its deepest divisions. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.